John, my friend, you have had a very interesting journey as far as getting to walk the shoes of some people that have come before you and left an interesting story behind. So why don't we start by having you set the stage for not only that journey, but the book that you put out based on it.
Well, perhaps I'll start with the story that I wrote about first, and then I can talk a bit about how I arrived there. So many of your listeners will remember the 1972 Andes flight disaster. It was a Uruguayan rugby team. They set out in October 1972 to fly to Chile. So Uruguay is on the east side of South America. Chile is on the west side. So to get from one to the other, you have to fly over the Andes. To cut a long story short, the plane lost its way in the Andes. It hit a mountain ridge. The wings came off. The tail came off. The fuselage tobogganed about a mile down the other side of the ridge and ended up in this extremely remote valley glacier in the high Andes. And remarkably, a bunch of them survived. There were, I think, in the few minutes after the accident, there were still 33 alive. By the next morning, because they crashed sort of late afternoon, by the next morning, there were still 29 alive. And of course, they expected to be rescued, and they waited and waited and waited, and they saw planes go over, but it became clear there wouldn't be any rescue. And indeed, the rescue forces had said, well, they'll all be dead. We'll resume the search in 3 months' time and when summer comes. And so they were left abandoned there. And really the stories about how they survived on the mountain, the various trials and tribulations they had, the expeditions they tried to make. And it wasn't until 72 days later that two of them managed to trek across the Andes, and they were spotted by a cattleman in the Andean foothills on the Chilean side, and he rode his mule down the mountain and alerted the authorities, and a rescue was effected. But that's just the main part of the story. Of course, there's a lot of detail that I've missed out on. But the story is extraordinary in many other ways. This was a very tightly knit group of people. They'd all gone to the same primary and middle school. And they had formed a rugby team that had become one of the best in Uruguay after they'd left school. Their ages range from 18, 19 up to 27. And so there were a close-knit community where the survivors and the families of the non-survivors lived side by side, and still do to this day. They live side by side. So that adds another remarkable dimension to this story. And there are many other aspects which maybe we'll get into, maybe we won't. But I was fascinated by the story from the time I read the authorized account of the tragedy, which was a book called Alive, and there was a film 20 years later called Alive, which many of your listeners may have seen. I was fascinated by the story when I read Alive in the 80s. I read it again and again. It was one of those things that obsessed me. But I always felt this dissatisfaction that in this story, which will be told about for many generations, it's such an iconic event in the history of human survival, that the people who didn't survive, who were so tightly integrated into that community, were mentioned only very briefly. And I was very interested in understanding about their lives and their families lives after the event and before the event. Um, and so when I started engaging with the community in 2013, when I went on an expedition to the crash site, I met one of the survivors. Through him, I met another survivor, and then I started to gradually build up contacts and become on good speaking terms with a large cross section of that community, both survivors and non-survivors. Um, and that was one part of my journey that persuaded me to write a book. And there are other parts of that journey which, perhaps we can get into later.
As I'm listening, there's this question that comes to mind, and I know this is kind of post experience and everything, but how exactly did that experience change the survivors?
Well, when they were before they were rescued, they hadn't realized, what a big story it would be. They had this quite naive thought of, well, we'll be rescued, and then we don't want to take another plane, so we'll take a train back across Argentina to Buenos Aires, and then take the boat over to Uruguay, and then we'll turn up at our houses, and our families will be, amazed to see us. They didn't realize what a sort of the magnitude of the story. And then, of course, when the news broke about what they'd done, that they'd had to use the bodies of their friends to survive, all hell broke loose. There were these sensationalist headlines in the newspapers, and which was largely, you know, when they arrived back in Uruguay after a few days in Chile after being rescued, they had a press conference and they addressed explicitly all the things that had happened on the mountain. And the press were actually remarkably good about, leaving the survivors alone. So now, how did it change their lives? Well, um, the long I mean, there's an answer to that, short term, medium term, and long term. In the short term, of course, they were immediate celebrities, but they were also a little bit reluctant to talk about the story in the community because they didn't want to upset or bring to mind, what had happened to their friends whose families lived in the same neighborhood. And so it was quite a muted reaction. And the what happened was that the 16 survivors, there were 16 survivors out of the 40 passengers and five crew. They had each other was one thing. So they talked about it a lot among themselves. And that acted as a sort of a psychological, boost. I mean, they weren't in isolation. So they're able to talk about them among themselves. They also, another aspect is that when the book was being was authorized with an English author, Piers Paul Reed, he came over and he interviewed them, and those interviews were very, I think, therapeutic, because initially they were reluctant to talk about things, but later they talked quite freely about what had happened on the mountain. So it was as if they were talking to a father confessor, and so I think that was a big help. And then I think a third thing in the immediate aftermath was that some of the families of those who died were remarkably, generous in how they reacted towards the young men. And I want to just read out a couple of things that they said. So one of the fathers commented to the press, "Thank God that 45 were there, so that 16 homes were able to gain their children." And his son had died, on the first day of the accident. Another mother said, "We support the decision taken by the the boys, and were trying to help them overcome this ordeal. So they felt that they were in, they'd lost their sons, but they felt that they were in the best position to provide support to the young men who'd survived, who felt guilty, not because of what they'd done, but because they had survived and their friends had died. They're close. These were close friends. I mean, this was a close community. A final aspect, I think I should say, is that the rugby, there was a rugby team. Not everyone played rugby. There were, out of the 15 members of the rugby team on the flight, only 5 came back. So many of them were sitting near the back of the plane. Some of them got sucked out when the tail came off. But they, the rugby club, really went from strength to strength, because a lot of people sort of poured their energies into the club to make it a success again. And so whether it was, brothers or or fathers, they put all their energies into the club, and it became not only a rugby club, but also a place where people would socialize and feel at home with each other. And so that was another thing. And then one more thing, final thing I want to mention, and this is more on the ones who didn't survive. There was a group of mothers of 13 or 15 mothers who, obviously very grief-stricken, but they felt that, look, we can't just sort of, sit and cry, for the next however many years. We need to do something to remember our sons. And they started a library whose proceeds helped the poor neighborhoods around what was quite an affluent neighborhood, buying textbooks, and eventually is still going strong today, run by the sisters of those who died. It provides scholarships and computer classes and so on to some of these less well-off neighborhoods. So I think there was a lot of community around the survivors. Now, of course, when the film came out, there was sort of a flurry of worldwide attention. But I think it wasn't until the survivors had sort of were reaching retirement age and they started writing memoirs that, and not only writing memoirs, but also they were quite in demand in the speakers circuit. So they became quite, quite well known across the world, especially some of them, Nando Parado and Roberto Canessa, who were the 2 young men who walked through the Andes, much in demand, but many of the others are as well. And so they started to get a higher profile. And around the turn of the millennium, there was a young man from Argentina, a guy called Alexis Carantino, and he started bringing the story to the web, bringing it online, creating an online community. And that really raised the profile of the whole, tragedy, the whole story. And today, the group, which is called Reviven, is now a Facebook group, which this young man started all those years ago. It's got about 80,000 followers. The survivors website has many more, followers, and so it has taken a lot of prominence. And then finally, this last year, there's been the film The Society of the Snow, which has been quite high profile. It was shortlisted for an Oscar for Best Foreign Film, and it's brought a lot more attention, to the story. So I think that sort of is about the extent of it. But in their personal lives, they've all, the thing is, they've lived this incredible experience, and then they had to come back and they had to get on with their lives. And so, they couldn't just sort of sit back and reflect on what had happened to them. They were young men, they needed to
Right.
get jobs, they were getting married and so on. So they all, some of them went through hard times, and some of them did pretty well, but they all just lived lives like everyone else. So they got on with things, and and now they're all retired, mostly retired. I think one or two of them still do some work. Yeah.
See, here's what I really find interesting because I think you opened up an amazing wormhole that can benefit everybody if they take the time to really think about where we're going with this now. Because when somebody from the outside takes a third person point of view and examines an experience like that, they find the human story within there that we all can connect from and we all can learn from. And as you talk about that healing process, when they initially came back and they started to learn how to adjust, there was obviously the shame or the sorrow that they survived while their comrades didn't, and they got to lean on the community to work their way through through that trauma. I think a lot of us, when we go through a traumatic experience in our own life, we get so shrouded in that shame that we feel we have to exclusively turn inward. We're not allowed to express it because we're holding ourselves back, thinking nobody can relate to that. And you get to the point where, you talk about the mothers of the people that didn't survive and how emphatic they became to jump on the process or the bandwagon, if you will, about helping these guys pull themselves back up and move back into a regular way of life. Regardless of all the positive outcomes of the hero journey that obviously they got the opportunity to walk. If you didn't have those fundamental pieces in there, they would not be where they're at today. That hero journey most likely never would have even began. So to bring it back to an individual perspective, realizing that it's okay to have that shame from the experience, but only to sit within it so long is how you move forward. Because within that shame, you get stuck and you're looking for that step to get you out of that cave. Well, that step is realizing that somebody else out in this world is going to be sympathetic to it, either because they've experienced it, they've actually got skin in the game with it, or they just have a heart capacity to be able to be compassionate toward what it is that you're going through. And that inevitably gets the ball rolling and gets that hero journey started. And I really love the fact that you took the time to put yourself in those shoes to, in a roundabout way, be able to uncover and share that story with the world.
Well, I think it was important that an outsider did it because I could give a very balanced view. But of course, I relied on the, generosity of spirit, the trust of all the families. I spoke with most of them who lost someone on the mountain, and there were different levels of how they interacted with the survivors. I think now the situation is very, very good, and I hope my book has helped to, create a more balanced view of the story, because an outsider's view of the story is something very remote and distant and sensational. It's the thing one about the story about the rugby players who ate each other, and that's not it's impersonal, but this was a very vibrant community they came from, a very close-knit community, and so that community was ready made to receive this. I mean, I can't imagine many other communities being able to absorb such a magnitude of tragedy as this one did. And it left a deep, deep scar. And it's taken, I think 50 years really for everyone to be talking about it without, without, so much distress. Um, and to go, I think it's useful to think about also one of the people who died was a crew member, the mechanic, and he died in an avalanche after a couple of weeks. Um, and his family, because it was not part of this community, was sort of cut off, lived in a different part of town, and they didn't know anyone. And so his son was a year and a half, and his son just knew he'd lost his father. He didn't know anything about it, and it wasn't until he was much older that he started to find out. So that sort of family suffered in isolation. But what's nice is that many years later, one of the survivors, he made contact. The son made contact with one of the survivors, and he was sort of brought into the community. And a lot of the questions he had about his father were resolved. Another, um, the pilot story is an extraordinary one. Um, the two biggest crashes in Uruguayan history. One was the crash of the Fairchild, which was the military plane that the rugby players were on. An even bigger crash was a C-47 that crashed in 78, and everyone died on board. It was a very tragic thing. There were lots of young people on there. The pilot on that was the brother of the pilot of the Uruguayan flight. So that was a family, and that flight's never talked about, even though it was, you know, uh, uh, just as tragic. Um, and in my book, I talk about this flight, and I give the names of the people who died in that, because you can't find them anywhere on the internet at all. But I was able to trace down the son of this second flight that crashed, the son of the pilot, and we had lots of nice chats. And now he's sort of come into the community, and so I think I'm actually quite gratified that my book has helped to sort of pull this community together, because I think because it wasn't spoken about a lot, even within the community, people didn't really like to ask the other families, too much about their son that they lost. But I try and tell the stories of everyone. And so now they're finding out bits about some of the other families, and that's also helping to bring the community together.
And you touched on a very, very important part of that because, yeah, this is a third person journey to explore the entire scenario from start to finish of the journey. But you mentioned the words that you felt gratified based off the fact that your work brought these other people together so that they could foster some healing and move forward with their lives. And I want to talk a lot about the process that you went through personally with the book. A lot of the thoughts and the feelings, because one of my favorite books is actually the biography of Daniel Boone. And there's so many different chapters to that. The first one actually never got published because the guy was so stricken with probably what we would call nowadays imposter syndrome. He put together all this work, but he got hung up on the fact that he didn't feel his work was number one, good enough, and number two, that he wasn't, I guess, the right person to put it out. And I wonder how much of that, at least in the beginning, you had to struggle with that internal struggle. What did that process look like for you?
Well, the process started off as just, great interest in the story. And the real, I guess the thing that engaged me, at a deeper level with the story was that I met one of the survivors, a guy called Pedro Algorta in Buenos Aires, and he would very kindly, agreed to have lunch with me. We had a nice chat. I was there with my son. We were on the way to um, the crash site. We were passing through Buenos Aires, and he had just published his memoir, and he was a guy I'd always admired, um, just because he was perhaps the most analytic of all the survivors and the most aloof. And I sort of, as an outsider, identified with that. And I told him, I'm going to translate your memoir, even though I didn't speak a word of Spanish. And he didn't believe me, but it actually turned out very well. I was able to translate it. I learned enough Spanish, and I made sure that I understood exactly what I was translating. And he speaks English, so I was able to communicate with him, make sure I got it right. And that sort of embedded me a little bit, because now I was the translator of Pedro's book. And through Pedro, two things happened. Okay, one is I contacted Piers Paul Reed, who the English author who wrote Alive, who lives in London, and he gave me access to his special access to his archive, which is very rich in information from the time. And the second thing that happened was that Pedro started introducing me to some of the families who didn't come back. So, for example, one of his good friends died on the first evening, on the first night on the mountain, and he put me in touch with his sister, and so that was my first contact with one of the families of someone who died on the mountain, and we had lots and lots of email conversations, and it sort of escalated from there. And so when I didn't know I was going to write a book, but I did. By the 2019, when I embarked on the book, I'd done a lot of research, and I'd amassed this big searchable database of every conceivable information. And I was sort of equipped with that. I went over to Uruguay. I had a sabbatical from my day job. I was a researcher in artificial intelligence in Cambridge. So armed with this, I went over there, and I thought, well, perhaps there's, I'd really like to tell these stories of those who didn't return from the mountain. Is there any appetite for it? I didn't really know, but I sort of started feeling my way a little bit. And to my surprise, people were willing to talk to me. So I said, look, I'm not a journalist. I'm not interested in any sensationalist description of this. I just want to understand, your brother, and what life was like before, what life was like after, what life was like during, what your brother was like, and to write his story just for history, because otherwise it will be lost to history. And it's important to balance. These survivors have been elevated to this, incredible height, and those who died are, down here, and I want to balance the story. And they were very responsive to that. And I must have done, I did 6 weeks of interviews. And they started off just, one every couple of days. And then by the end, I was doing 2, 3, 4 a day, as word of mouth spread about what I was doing. And I think people were still a little bit skeptical. Now, did I have imposter syndrome at the time? I think I don't think it was extreme imposter syndrome, because I felt that I knew more about the story than anyone else. And actually, that body of knowledge was very important when I interviewed the families, because they saw I wasn't someone who's just sort of, spent an hour sort of reading up on stuff and coming into an interview. I could pull facts left, right, and center, and they were amazed really by the information I had. So in that sense, I felt secure in my knowledge. Um, as regards, will I be able to write a book? I wasn't an author. I'd written technical papers, but I'd never written, and I'd translated a couple of books of the survivors, but I hadn't actually created a work, created a book. So there was certainly some anxiety there. But I wrote, those are the first things I wrote in the book, was the stories of these people. And I sent them out to say, look, this is the story. I've written it up. Did I get it correct? And when they saw the reality of that, then that evoked an opening up even more about the brother they'd lost. And so then I rewrote those stories, and then the rest of it, I think I had the sense of it being somehow something I was supposed to be doing, that I was the only person who could do this. And therefore, I didn't really feel I was an imposter, but I did feel that, I had a lot of things I had to deal with, because I had many aspects of the story I was covering. I had many sources, I had many, contacts I had to constantly be, talking to and revising things in the book and so on. So it was a massive project, and I retired from my job to complete it. But I don't think I ever thought that I wouldn't complete it by the 50th anniversary, which was my self-imposed deadline was the 50th anniversary. So yeah, that's about that's how it was.
I think the human side of, from the author's perspective within that story is very fascinating, because there is, and I can relate, being a podcaster and a writer myself, there's like this epic story that's in our head that we're trying to find all the right pieces to fit on the puzzle board at the right time. And it can be a struggle sometimes. We have to fight ourselves internally because, yeah, we are on this mission that we are the only one that can do this certain calling.
Yeah.
So it may look right in our head. Finding all the physical pieces can be extremely frustrating.
Yeah.
And, I can relate a lot to bouncing back and forth between the anxiety and even at times the imposter syndrome in the beginning of it, because here you've lived and gained the knowledge to put you on the path. But, it gets back to, again, putting those puzzle pieces together. And I
Yeah.
really commend you on holding yourself to it, essentially putting your ass in the chair and making it happen while living and enjoying the experience. So, as our time starts to kind of wind down here, toward the end of the conversation, I like to give you the opportunity to speak to somebody that may be in that very position where they're struggling with that imposter syndrome. They're struggling with the anxiety of getting the ball rolling so they can pursue whatever it is that is in their head that they're struggling to find the puzzle pieces for. Give them some advice.
Well, first of all, I think the imposter syndrome is an impediment that is of no use to you at all, right? What you have to do is you first of all you have to work really hard. You have to plan for success. You have to assume you're going to succeed, and under that assumption, you have to plan how you're going to do it. And there's no space in there for thinking, well, I'm not good enough to do this, or you know, there's going to be some barrier. If you see barriers ahead of you, you have to aggressively go after and deal with them. You have to say, look, I understand this is going to be a problem that I'm going to have to deal with. How am I going to have to deal with it? So there's a lot of, I think, I just think there's not really time to get hung up by an imposter. You can't. There can't be that. anxiety of that angst. You have to be fully committed. You have to be planning. You have to assume that you're going to succeed, and everything will follow from that. I assumed I would be able to, solve this part of the book, and how was I going to do that? Well, I had to do this, this, and this, and perhaps I had to travel there to do this, and I assumed I would be doing it, and I made, the arrangements, and I did the necessary research and had the necessary conversations, and I forced myself to write. That's another thing is if you're writing a book, you've got to force yourself to write, even if that day you don't think you're going to, what you're writing may be really poor. But if you write it down, even though it's poor, you can revisit it. And that work you've done in writing it down is going to be worthwhile, because now you know what doesn't quite work. So there are a few thoughts.
I think those thoughts are actually very thought provoking for one, but they're also very powerful. When you listen to somebody share their experience of how they got from point A to point B, and then they couple that with some powerful tips to help you to, I guess, start to strike the match and light the fire underneath you. It really does impact somebody. So, John, I want to thank you for not only taking your time to celebrate your work and celebrate the lives of those that didn't make it, as well as the ones that did, as well as bringing the human aspect of your story to the campfire today. So thank you very much for being here. Before I let you go, you got to do the shameless plugs and let everybody know how to get in touch with you, get your book, what you got coming up, all that great stuff.
Okay, well, you can find everything at my website, which is johnguiver.org. That's JOHNGUIV for Victor ER.org. And there's a page there with the books on. There's a link to various podcasts and documentaries and so on. And there's also a contact tab if you need to get in touch with me.
Beautiful. Well, John, thank you so much again. I hope to get to connect with you again sometime down the road. I don't believe in goodbyes, so until we meet again, whether it's in this life or the next, have a safe and pleasant journey, my friend.
Okay, thank you, Mike. Thank you for inviting me.